There is a particular hour that arrives after the noise of the day has finally settled. The conversations have ended. The tasks have been set down, even if not finished. The house has grown quiet, or as quiet as it will ever be, and somewhere beneath the blankets, in the dim light or no light at all, the mind begins to do what it so often does when everything else has gone still. It begins to work. It replays a conversation from earlier in the day, turning it over, searching for a better version of what was said. It imagines a conversation that has not yet happened, rehearsing words for a moment that may never arrive in the way it is imagined. It reaches toward tomorrow and the week after, and sometimes toward years that are nothing more than shapes in the distance, trying to secure something, trying to know what cannot yet be known. This is not unusual. It is, in fact, one of the most human things a person can experience. The mind, when finally given space, often uses that space to search for control. Not because it wishes to cause harm, but because it is trying, in its own way, to keep you safe. It believes that if it can only think enough, plan enough, anticipate enough, then the uncertain edges of life might become a little less sharp. And yet, if you have ever lain awake doing exactly this, you may have noticed something quietly frustrating about the process. The thinking rarely resolves anything. The turning over of old conversations does not change what was said. The rehearsing of future ones does not guarantee they will unfold as imagined. The mind works, and still, in the morning, the world remains as uncertain as it was the night before. This restlessness, this quiet and often exhausting reaching for control, is something that has been observed and studied for a very long time. Long before modern life, long before the particular pressures of today, there were those who noticed this same pattern in the human mind and asked a simple but far-reaching question. What is actually within our power and what is not? This question sits at the heart of a philosophy known as Stoicism, developed in ancient Greece and later carried forward by thinkers in Rome. It is not a philosophy that promises to remove uncertainty from life. It does not offer techniques for predicting the future or formulas for guaranteeing outcomes. Instead, it offers something quieter and, in its own way, more durable. It offers a different relationship with the parts of life that were never within your control to begin with. One of the clearest voices in this tradition belongs to a man named Epictetus, who was born into slavery in the 1st century and later became one of the most influential teachers of his time. Having lived much of his early life without the freedom to determine even the basic conditions of his own body, Epictetus developed a way of thinking that did not depend on external circumstances for its stability. He taught that human beings are constantly, almost instinctively, dividing the world into 2 categories. Though most people never notice they are doing it, there is the category of what is up to us, our judgments, our intentions, the way we choose to interpret what happens to us. And there is the much larger category of what is not up to us, other people, outcomes, health, reputation, time, the actions of the world at large. Much of human suffering, Epictetus suggested, comes not from the events themselves, but from placing our sense of peace inside the second category, the one we were never meant to hold. This is not a small idea, though it is often stated simply. And it is not one that resolves itself the moment it is heard. It is something to sit with, slowly, the way one might sit with a piece of music, that reveals more each time it is played. Tonight is not about mastering this idea. It is not about applying it, or fixing anything, or becoming someone who no longer feels the pull toward control. It is simply an invitation to sit for a while in the company of these old and steady thoughts, to let them move through you the way night air moves through an open window, without effort, without urgency. Letting go, in this sense, is not defeat. It is not giving up on life or ceasing to care about what happens. It is something closer to understanding. A recognition that certain things were never yours to hold in the first place, and that trying to hold them was always going to be tiring. So for now, there is nothing to solve. There is only this quiet hour and the slow unfolding of an old and patient way of seeing. It may help to understand something about the origins of this philosophy, not as a matter of academic interest, but simply as a way of settling into the voice that will guide these reflections. Stoicism began in Athens, in a marketplace lined with painted colonnades, where a teacher named Zeno first gathered students to discuss how a person might live well regardless of circumstance. It traveled from there across centuries, carried by soldiers, statesmen, slaves, and emperors alike, each finding in it something suited to their own particular hardship. This is part of what makes the philosophy feel different from certain other traditions. It was never developed in comfort, tested only in theory. Epictetus taught from a position of having lost his freedom entirely. Seneca wrote many of his most steadying letters while facing serious political danger, uncertain whether each day might be his last. Marcus Aurelius, though an emperor with immense worldly power, faced plague, war, and the loss of several of his own children, writing his private reflections not from a position of ease, but from the middle of considerable and ongoing hardship. This matters because it means the ideas explored across this evening were never simply comforting phrases offered from a place of safety. They were tools tested under real pressure, refined across lives that included genuine loss and genuine uncertainty. When Epictetus speaks of what is and is not within our control, he speaks as someone who once had almost nothing left that could be called his own, except, as he came to understand it, his own judgments. There is something steadying in knowing this. The voice guiding tonight's reflection is not a voice promising an easy path around difficulty. It is a voice that has already walked through difficulty and found even there a kind of quiet that did not depend on circumstances finally becoming easy. You do not need to carry any of this history forward with effort. It is simply here, in the background, the way a familiar melody might rest beneath a conversation, without needing to be consciously followed. What matters more is simply allowing the evening to unfold, one quiet reflection following another, each one returning, in its own way, to the same steady center. There is also something worth saying about the purpose of this particular kind of listening. This is not a lesson to be memorized, nor a set of instructions to be applied tomorrow morning like a checklist. It is closer to companionship, an hour spent alongside old ideas that have already comforted a great many people across a great many centuries, offered here simply as company for whatever this particular night happens to hold. There is no requirement to agree with every idea explored in the chapters ahead. Philosophy, at its best, is not a demand for immediate belief, but an invitation to consider, to sit with, to turn an idea over, and see how it feels when held against the particular texture of your own life. Some ideas will resonate immediately. Others may take longer, revisited on other nights, in other quiet hours, before they begin to settle into something familiar. What matters most for tonight is simply the willingness to listen without pressure, to let these old reflections move through the mind the way a slow tide moves across a shore, arriving, receding, leaving behind only what settles naturally, asking nothing more than your quiet attention for a while. It is worth pausing, before going further into the philosophy itself, to consider why the mind reaches for control so persistently in the first place. This reaching is not a flaw to be corrected. It is closer to an old habit, formed for good reason, that has simply outgrown its usefulness in certain moments. Human beings evolved in conditions where anticipating danger mattered a great deal. A mind that could imagine what might happen next, that could rehearse threats before they arrived, was a mind more likely to survive. This capacity for forward thinking, for scanning the horizon of possibility, was not a weakness. It was, for a very long time, a form of protection. The difficulty is that this same capacity does not know when to rest. It does not distinguish easily between a genuine threat and an imagined one. It cannot always tell the difference between preparing wisely for tomorrow and simply repeating worry in the shape of preparation. And so the mind, doing what it has always done, continues to reach for certainty even in moments when certainty was never available to begin with. There is comfort in this reaching, even when it does not work. Planning feels like doing something. Imagining outcomes feels like influencing them, even when it does not actually change anything at all. There is a kind of psychological shelter in believing that if we think about something enough, we are somehow protecting ourselves from it. This is understandable. It is deeply human. And it is, in most cases, an illusion. Consider how often the mind returns to situations that have already unfolded, searching for a different outcome that can no longer be reached. Consider how often it travels forward into situations that have not yet occurred, trying to prepare for possibilities that may never take the shape imagined. In both directions, the mind is often reaching for a form of control that does not actually exist. The past cannot be revised, the future cannot be fully known, and yet the desire for certainty remains. Certainty about how others feel about us. Certainty about how our efforts will be received. Certainty about our health, our finances, our relationships, the shape our lives will take in years not yet arrived. It is not wrong to want these things. It would be strange not to want them. But wanting certainty and possessing it are two very different conditions, and much of the mind's restlessness comes from confusing one for the other. There is nothing shameful in this. It does not mean something has gone wrong with you. It simply means you are a person, living inside a mind that developed to protect you, sometimes working a little too hard at a task it was never fully capable of completing. The Stoics did not condemn this tendency. They did not view the desire for control as a personal failing to be eliminated through force of will. Instead, they approached it the way one might approach an old friend, with a familiar and sometimes exhausting habit, with patience, with understanding, and gradually with the gentle suggestion that there might be another way to move through the world. This is where the philosophy begins, not with judgment, but with recognition, a quiet acknowledgement that the mind's reach for control, however constant, however tiring, comes from something worth understanding rather than something worth resisting. In the chapters that follow, this recognition will slowly deepen into something more workable. Not a solution, exactly, but a different way of standing in relation to the parts of life that were never within reach. For now, it is enough to notice. To notice the reaching without needing to stop it. To notice the mind at work without needing it to be otherwise. There is a kind of rest simply in observing this pattern rather than fighting it, in seeing it clearly rather than being carried along by it without awareness. The night continues. The room remains quiet, and somewhere beneath the noticing, the reaching begins, very slowly, to loosen its grip. There is a particular kind of scenario the mind seems especially drawn to at night, one worth naming gently before moving further. It is the scenario in which imagining a problem thoroughly enough begins to feel like a form of preparation, even when no actual action follows the imagining. The mind constructs a difficult conversation in full detail, complete with words, tone, even the imagined reaction of the other person. And somewhere in the middle of this construction, a quiet belief takes hold. The belief that this rehearsal is somehow useful, somehow protective, even though nothing about the actual future has been altered by it. This is worth noticing without judgment, because it reveals something honest about how the mind attempts to manage uncertainty. It cannot simply sit with not knowing. Not knowing feels to the mind like exposure, like vulnerability, like standing in an open field with no shelter nearby. So it builds shelter out of thought itself, out of endless rehearsal, out of imagined scenarios that feel, in the moment, like a kind of readiness. But readiness and rehearsal are not always the same thing. Genuine readiness usually involves a few clear, specific actions, taken once and then set aside. Rehearsal, in its more anxious form, involves endless repetition, the same scenario replayed with slight variations, none of them bringing any closer to resolution, all of them borrowing energy from a present moment that could otherwise simply rest. It may be worth asking gently, without pressure, whether tonight's wandering thoughts belong more to genuine readiness or to this looping kind of rehearsal. There is no need to answer definitively. The question itself, held loosely, can sometimes be enough to soften the grip a little, to remind the mind that it does not need to solve everything before it is permitted to rest. Consider, too, how much of this reaching for control is shaped not by the present circumstances themselves, but by old patterns, formed long ago, in moments when vigilance genuinely mattered. A mind that learned early that unpredictability meant danger may continue to treat ordinary uncertainty as though it carried the same weight long after the original circumstances have changed. This is not a flaw. It is simply the nature of a mind shaped by experience, carrying old lessons forward into situations where they no longer quite fit. Understanding this does not require solving it tonight. It only requires a kind of gentleness toward the pattern itself, a recognition that the reaching for control, however tiring, however familiar, comes from an old and understandable place, one that deserves patience rather than frustration. There is one more aspect of this reaching worth naming gently before moving on, and that is the way the mind sometimes mistakes worry for love. A parent lying awake worrying about a child may feel that the worry itself is a form of devotion, as though ceasing to worry would somehow mean caring less. A person concerned about a friend's difficulty may feel that turning the situation over repeatedly in their mind is a way of standing beside that friend, even from a distance, even without any actual ability to change the circumstance. This connection between worry and care is deeply understandable, and it is not wrong to feel it. But it is worth asking, gently, whether worry actually accomplishes what it seems to promise. Does turning a difficulty over again and again in the mind actually help the person being worried about? Or does it simply exhaust the one doing the worrying, without changing anything in the world beyond the boundaries of their own tired thoughts? Care can exist without worry. A person can hold someone in their thoughts with warmth and hope, without needing to rehearse every possible difficulty that might befall them. This is not indifference. It is, in its own way, a deeper form of trust. Trust that the other person's life belongs to them. Trust that the world will unfold as it unfolds regardless of how many hours are spent anxiously anticipating its turns. This distinction between worry and care may be one of the gentlest and most useful recognitions available in the quiet of this hour. Whatever concern currently occupies the mind, whatever person or situation is being turned over again and again, there may be room to hold that concern with warmth rather than vigilance, with hope rather than rehearsal, releasing the exhausting work of anticipation, while keeping fully intact the genuine care that gave rise to it in the first place. At the center of Epictetus's teaching lies a single distinction, simple to state and endlessly deep to live inside. He called it the division between what is up to us and what is not. What is up to us, he said, includes our judgments, our intentions, our desires, our aversions, and in short, everything that is truly our own doing. What is not up to us includes our bodies, our possessions, our reputations, our positions, and in short, everything that is not truly our own doing. Notice the shape of this division. It does not divide the world into good things and bad things, or important things and unimportant things. It divides the world according to a single question. Does this belong to my inner activity, my judgments and choices, or does it belong to the outer world, shaped by forces beyond my determination? Health belongs to the outer world. You may care for your body, you may act wisely toward it, but its ultimate condition is shaped by countless factors beyond your command. Reputation belongs to the outer world. You may act with integrity, but how others perceive you, what they choose to believe, remains outside your authorship. Even the outcomes of your own efforts, Epictetus suggested, belong partly to this outer category, because the world often has its own plans, regardless of how carefully you have prepared. What remains then, in the inner category, may seem at first almost too small to matter. Your judgments, your intentions, the interpretations you place on what happens to you. And yet Epictetus believed this small territory was, in fact, the only territory a person ever truly possessed, and that a well-lived life depended entirely on tending to it carefully. This is not a philosophy of passivity. It does not suggest that a person should stop acting in the world, stop working toward goals, stop caring about outcomes. It suggests something more precise, that a person should act fully, care deeply, and try earnestly, while understanding that the results of these efforts were never guaranteed to begin with. Much of human suffering, Epictetus argued, comes from a kind of confusion between these two categories. We treat outcomes as though they were ours to command, and then feel betrayed or shattered when they do not unfold as expected. We treat other people's opinions as though they were within our authorship, and then feel wounded when those opinions differ from what we hoped. We treat the future as though it belonged to us, and then feel anxious when it refuses to reveal itself in advance. None of this confusion is a personal failure. It is, in many ways, the default condition of an unexamined mind. Epictetus did not claim that seeing this distinction clearly was easy. He spent much of his teaching simply repeating it in different forms, from different angles, because he understood that a truth this simple could still take a lifetime to truly absorb. Consider for a moment how much of the mind's nighttime activity is spent in the outer category, rehearsing what someone else might think, trying to predict how a situation beyond your control might unfold, attempting, through sheer mental effort, to secure outcomes that were never within your power to secure in the first place. There is no need tonight to resolve this. There is no instruction to follow, no technique to apply. There is only the quiet observation that a very old teacher, speaking from a position of genuine hardship, found a kind of steadiness by returning again and again to this single distinction. What is mine to shape, and what is not? It is a question that does not need to be answered all at once. It can simply be held gently, the way one might hold a smooth stone found on a quiet path, turning it over without urgency, letting its shape become familiar over time. Epictetus taught from a small room, likely with very few possessions. Addressing students who often arrived with considerable status and wealth, people accustomed to a great deal of control over their external circumstances. He would ask them simple questions. Is your body entirely your own, free from illness, aging, and eventual death? Is your reputation entirely your own, immune to the shifting opinions of others? Is your position in life entirely your own, safe from the changing fortunes that shape every human community? Each answer, given honestly, revealed the same thing. Almost nothing external was ever fully secured. This might sound bleak, stated plainly. And yet Epictetus did not intend it as bleakness. He intended it as clarity, a clearing away of illusion so that attention could be placed where it actually belonged. If health, reputation, and position were never fully within command to begin with, then placing one's peace inside them was always going to produce a kind of instability, since instability was already built into the nature of those things. What remained in his teaching was not nothing. It was, in fact, everything that truly mattered in terms of a person's own character. The capacity to choose how to respond to hardship, the capacity to remain honest, even when honesty was costly, the capacity to meet loss with dignity rather than collapse. These capacities, Epictetus insisted, could not be taken by any external force, not by illness, not by exile, not even by the loss of freedom itself, because they belonged entirely to the inner territory of judgment and choice. This does not mean external circumstances do not matter. Epictetus was not indifferent to comfort, health, or the well-being of those he cared about. He simply placed these things in their proper category, valuable, worth caring for, but never mistaken for the foundation of a person's peace. The foundation, in his teaching, rested elsewhere, in a much smaller but far more stable territory. Consider gently how much of tonight's mental activity concerns the outer category rather than the inner one. How much of the wandering thought is directed toward outcomes, opinions, and circumstances beyond direct influence, and how much is directed toward the quieter, steadier territory of one's own judgments and intentions. There is no need to force a shift between these categories tonight. It is enough simply to notice where the attention has been resting, and to let that noticing exist quietly, without further demand. There is a particular kind of freedom that Epictetus described as belonging only to those who no longer confuse these two categories, a freedom he considered available even to a person with very little external power, since it depended entirely on the inner territory rather than the outer one. This is a striking claim, especially coming from a man who had experienced firsthand what it meant to have almost no external power at all. He was not speaking theoretically. He was describing something he had come to understand through direct and difficult experience. This freedom does not mean indifference to circumstance. It means a particular kind of steadiness that does not depend on circumstance remaining favorable. A person can lose position, health, or reputation, and still retain the capacity to choose their own responses, to maintain their own integrity, to continue shaping their own character according to their own values. This capacity, Epictetus argued, could not be taken by any external force, because it never belonged to the external world in the first place. There is something worth sitting with in this idea tonight, not as a demand to achieve this freedom immediately, but simply as a possibility held gently in mind. Whatever external uncertainties exist in your own life right now, whatever outcomes remain unresolved, there remains, underneath all of it, a quieter territory that has not been touched by any of these uncertainties at all. The capacity to meet tonight with a measure of patience. The capacity to choose, even now, a slightly gentler interpretation of the day that has passed. This territory remains fully intact, regardless of how the outer world happens to be unfolding. There is a particular kind of tiredness that comes not from physical exertion, but from the constant, quiet effort of trying to manage everything at once. It is the tiredness of a mind that has been standing guard for a very long time, watching for what might go wrong, anticipating what might need to be prevented, holding a kind of vigilance that rarely, if ever, fully rests. This vigilance often shows up in ordinary places. In relationships, where a person may find themselves constantly reading the moods of others, adjusting their own behavior to prevent conflict before it has even appeared. In work, where a person may feel responsible not only for their own actions, but for outcomes shaped by dozens of forces entirely outside their reach. In reputation, where a person may spend considerable energy imagining how they are perceived, trying to shape an impression that, in truth, was never fully within their authorship. None of this is unusual. It is, in fact, extremely common, so common that it often goes unnoticed as a distinct pattern rather than simply the ordinary experience of being alive. And yet, beneath the surface of daily life, this constant management carries a real cost. It is exhausting to try to hold so much. It is exhausting to feel responsible for outcomes that were never entirely yours to determine. Stoicism does not respond to this exhaustion with criticism. It does not suggest that a person who feels this weight has done something wrong. Instead, it gently points toward the source of the weight itself. Much of it comes not from caring, which is natural and even admirable, but from believing that caring must be accompanied by control, that love or diligence or responsibility somehow require the ability to guarantee outcomes. Consider a parent who wishes deeply for their child's happiness. This wish is good. It is human. But if the parent believes that this wish must be accompanied by full control over the child's future, an impossible standard has quietly been set, one that will produce anxiety no matter how much love is present. The Stoic response is not to care less, but to separate the caring from the demand for guaranteed results. Consider someone working carefully on a project, hoping it will be well received. The effort itself is fully within their control. The reception is not. If the two become fused together in the mind, as though effort and outcome were the same thing, then every uncertain outcome becomes a referendum on the effort itself, and the weight of this fusion becomes very heavy indeed. This fusion, this quiet blending of what can be controlled with what cannot, is often the true source of the exhaustion many people carry without fully naming it. It is not the caring that exhausts. It is the invisible demand, layered on top of the caring, that the world cooperate fully with our wishes. There is no need tonight to solve this pattern all at once. It has likely been present for a long time, shaped slowly over years, and it will not dissolve simply because it has been named. But there is something valuable in simply seeing it, in recognizing the shape of the vigilance, the shape of the constant management, and beginning to sense where effort ends and where an old, unspoken demand for guaranteed outcomes quietly begins. Seneca once observed that we suffer more in imagination than in reality. Much of the weight carried through vigilance belongs to this imagined suffering, the anticipation of what has not happened and may never happen at all. There is a kind of rest available simply in recognizing this, even before anything else changes. For now, let the weight be noticed rather than fixed. Let it be seen clearly in the quiet of this hour, without the pressure of resolving it before sleep arrives. There is an image sometimes used to describe this kind of vigilance, that of a person standing watch over a house through the night, checking every window, every lock, every sound, unable to rest because rest feels, to them, like abandoning their post. This image captures something true about the way constant management can begin to feel identical to responsibility itself, as though setting the vigilance down would mean neglecting something important, even when the vigilance itself accomplishes very little beyond exhaustion. But a house does not actually require someone awake at every hour to remain safe. Locks, once checked, remain locked, whether or not someone continues checking them. Much of the constant management carried through daily life resembles this unnecessary rechecking, returning again and again to something already handled, already set in motion, already beyond further influence for the moment. This tendency often grows from good intentions, a desire to prevent harm, a desire to protect the people we care about, a desire to avoid the discomfort of being caught unprepared. None of these desires are wrong, but when they extend into constant, unrelenting vigilance over things already beyond further influence, they stop serving their original purpose and begin instead to simply produce fatigue. Seneca wrote to his friend Lucilius about the particular exhaustion of a mind that never fully rests, comparing it to a container constantly being poured into without ever being allowed to settle. There is a kind of wisdom in recognizing when enough has been done, when the checking has served its purpose, and when continuing to check serves no one, least of all the person doing the checking. This recognition does not arrive all at once. It is built slowly, through repeated moments of noticing, through gentle questions asked quietly in moments like this one. Has this already been handled? Is there anything more that can actually be done right now? Or is this simply the mind once again, standing watch over a house whose locks were checked long ago? There is no requirement to answer these questions definitively tonight. It is enough to let them exist quietly, as an invitation rather than a demand, a way of gently testing whether the vigilance currently being carried is still serving its purpose, or whether it has, perhaps without anyone noticing, become simply another form of tiredness carried out of habit rather than necessity. There is also a particular kind of weight that comes from believing responsibility must always look like effort, that caring for something or someone requires constant active management in order to count as genuine care. This belief, rarely examined directly, can quietly shape an entire life, filling even restful hours with a low hum of unfinished obligation, as though setting the management down, even briefly, would somehow mean caring less. But care and constant management are not the same thing. A garden, tended thoughtfully, does not require standing over it every hour of the day. It requires attention at the right moments, and trust the rest of the time. Trust that growth continues even when it is not being watched. The same may be true of many of the things carried through vigilance: relationships, responsibilities, ongoing projects. They often continue quietly, in their own time, without requiring the constant oversight the mind insists upon. This is not a suggestion to become careless or indifferent. It is simply an invitation to consider whether some portion of tonight's mental weight belongs to genuine, necessary attention, and whether some other portion belongs to a habit of vigilance that has simply outgrown its usefulness, continuing more out of momentum than actual necessity. There is no need to sort this out fully tonight. It is enough to hold the question loosely, allowing whatever answer eventually surfaces to arrive in its own time. It may help, too, to remember that setting vigilance down for a night does not mean abandoning it forever. Rest is not the opposite of responsibility. It is often what makes responsibility sustainable across days, weeks, and years, rather than something collapsing under its own accumulated weight after too many sleepless nights spent standing guard over things that did not require guarding. Tomorrow, if genuine attention is needed somewhere, it will still be available. Tonight asks only for its absence, briefly, so that whatever attention is needed tomorrow can arrive rested rather than depleted. Marcus Aurelius, who ruled as Emperor of Rome and who left behind a private journal never intended for publication, wrote often and quietly about the nature of change. Not change as an occasional disruption to an otherwise stable life, but change as the very fabric of existence itself, constant, ongoing, and impossible to separate from what it means to be alive. He observed the seasons, the way summer gives way to autumn without asking permission, the way the natural world moves through cycles of growth and decay without resistance. He observed the aging of his own body, the shifting of political fortunes, the rise and fall of people and circumstances around him. And from these observations, he returned again and again to a single quiet insight. Nothing stays as it is. Nothing was ever meant to. This might sound at first like a source of sadness, and in certain moods it can feel that way. But Marcus Aurelius did not write about change with despair. He wrote about it with a kind of steady acceptance, even reverence, as though recognizing the constant movement of life allowed him to meet it more gently, rather than being repeatedly surprised or wounded by what was, in truth, entirely natural. Consider how much distress arises not from change itself, but from the resistance to change. A season ends, and there is a kind of grief in the ending. But there is also relief in knowing that another season follows. A friendship shifts, a role changes, a body ages, and beneath the discomfort of these transitions often lies a quieter discomfort, the sense that things were supposed to stay as they were, that change itself represents something going wrong rather than something simply occurring. Marcus Aurelius suggested a different orientation. Rather than resisting the fact of change, one might instead expect it, anticipate it, meet it as an old and familiar companion, rather than an intruder. This does not remove the difficulty of transitions. Loss remains loss. Endings remain endings. But there is a difference between meeting an ending as a betrayal of how things were supposed to be, and meeting it as part of the ordinary unfolding of a life lived among other, changing lives. He wrote of the universe as a river, carrying all things along its current, nothing standing still for long. This image of life as movement rather than fixed structure offers a kind of quiet permission to stop expecting stillness where stillness was never truly available, permission to hold circumstances a little more loosely, knowing that loosening the grip does not cause the change. It simply allows a person to move with it rather than against it. There is a particular gentleness in this idea when it is brought into the quiet hours of night. So much of nighttime worry involves trying to hold a moment in place, to prevent the next day from arriving with its uncertainties, to keep the present exactly as it is out of fear of what comes next. And yet the night itself is proof of this constant movement. It arrives, it deepens, and eventually it gives way to morning, regardless of what the mind wishes to hold on to. Marcus Aurelius did not ask his readers to stop feeling the weight of change. He simply invited them to see it clearly, to recognize it as the shape of life itself, rather than a disruption of some other, more stable existence that was never actually available to begin with. Tonight, in this quiet hour, there is no need to resolve this fully. There is only the slow, spacious recognition that change is not something happening to life. Change is what life is made of. And there is a kind of rest available in no longer resisting the very nature of the thing you are living inside. Marcus Aurelius often reflected on the body's own transformation across a lifetime, noting that the person he had been as a child no longer existed in any literal sense, replaced gradually, cell by cell, year by year, by someone continuously new, and yet somehow continuous as well. This observation, that a person is never quite the same from one year to the next, offers a particular kind of comfort when applied to present difficulty. Whatever version of yourself is struggling tonight with a particular worry will not be the same version of yourself facing whatever comes next. Change, even within the boundaries of a single life, is already constantly occurring, already carrying you forward, whether or not the mind chooses to notice it. There is also a quieter observation within his writing, one that concerns the relationship between resistance and suffering. He suggested that things themselves rarely have the power to disturb us directly. What disturbs is the belief that things ought to be different than they currently are, the quiet insistence that the season should not yet be ending, that the circumstance should not yet be shifting, that the moment should somehow remain fixed against its own natural tendency to move forward. This insistence, however understandable, places a person in constant tension with the basic nature of existence. It is possible, instead, to meet change the way one might meet weather, not by demanding that the sky remain clear indefinitely, but by recognizing that clouds and rain are simply part of what weather is, and that resisting this fact does not prevent the rain. It only adds frustration on top of getting wet. Marcus Aurelius returned to this idea often enough that it becomes clear he did not find it easy either. He was not writing from a place of having fully mastered acceptance. He was writing from a place of needing, repeatedly, to remind himself of something true but difficult to hold on to, especially during genuinely hard seasons of loss, illness, and political strain. This matters because it means the practice being explored tonight is not a fixed achievement, reached once and then maintained effortlessly. It is closer to a returning, again and again, to the same steady recognition, softened a little more each time it is revisited. Tonight is simply one more of these returnings, offered gently, without pressure, into the quiet unfolding of whatever change is currently present in your own life. There is a particular comfort available in noticing how many changes have already been survived, quietly, without dramatic effort, simply by continuing to live through them one day at a time. The person you were 5 years ago faced uncertainties that, at the time, may have felt just as consuming as whatever uncertainty occupies the mind tonight. And yet here you are, having moved through that earlier uncertainty, carried forward by the same steady, ongoing current of change that once felt so threatening and now belongs quietly to the past. This is not offered as a guarantee that every future difficulty will resolve easily. Some changes bring genuine loss that cannot be minimized or explained away. But there is still something worth noticing in this pattern of having already moved through so much change already. Evidence gathered simply through the act of having lived this long. That change, however uncomfortable, has not been the ending it sometimes appeared to be in its earlier, more uncertain moments. Marcus Aurelius wrote of nature as endlessly resourceful, always finding new forms out of what came before, never simply destroying without also creating something new in its place. Even endings, in this view, are never quite final in the way they first appear. They are transitions, doorways between one form of existence and another, uncomfortable in the moment of passing through, but rarely as absolute as they seem when viewed too closely, too anxiously, in the middle of the transition itself. There is no need to apply this fully to whatever change currently occupies your own thoughts tonight. It is enough simply to hold the pattern loosely, to remember that change, however unsettling, has so far always been survivable, and that this particular change, whatever shape it eventually takes, will likely join the long, ordinary list of transitions already carried through, quietly, simply by continuing forward. Seneca, writing letters to a friend named Lucilius, returned often to a particular observation about the human mind. He noticed that people tend to suffer more from imagined misfortunes than from the misfortunes that actually arrive. The mind, given space, will often travel ahead into the future, constructing detailed and painful scenarios about what might happen, and in doing so, it experiences a kind of suffering in advance, suffering that may never correspond to anything that actually occurs. This observation, made nearly 2,000 years ago, describes something remarkably familiar to anyone who has lain awake at night, imagining a difficult conversation that has not yet happened, or a loss that has not yet occurred, or a failure that exists only as a possibility rather than a reality. The body responds to these imagined scenarios almost as though they were real. The heart quickens, the chest tightens, and yet nothing in the actual world has happened at all. Seneca did not suggest that preparation itself was the problem. He believed in thinking ahead, in considering difficulties with clear eyes, in being ready for hardship rather than pretending it would never arrive. What concerned him was a different activity entirely, one that resembles preparation but functions quite differently. The activity of dwelling, of returning again and again to imagined pain, without any accompanying action, without any genuine movement toward readiness, simply repeating the discomfort for its own sake. There is a meaningful difference between preparing wisely and living mentally inside a future that has not yet occurred and may never occur in the form imagined. Preparation involves clear, specific steps taken in the present. Dwelling involves an endless loop of imagined scenarios, each one slightly different, none of them resolving anything, all of them borrowing suffering from a future that remains, in truth, unknown. Seneca suggested that much of this suffering could be softened simply by noticing the difference between what is actually happening and what the mind is imagining might happen. This is not a technique to force the mind into silence. It is closer to a gentle observation, a quiet noticing that says, "This fear belongs to an imagined future, not to the present moment I am actually standing inside." He also wrote about the relationship between anticipation and gratitude, suggesting that a mind trained to expect disaster around every corner often loses its capacity to notice the ordinary steadiness of the present. If every quiet evening is treated as merely the calm before some anticipated storm, the quiet itself is never fully experienced. The mind is always somewhere else, bracing for what has not arrived. This does not mean pretending difficulty will never come. Seneca was not a man who avoided hardship in his writing or his life. He simply believed that most imagined hardship, rehearsed again and again in the mind, added a kind of unnecessary suffering on top of whatever difficulty might eventually and actually arrive. Life would bring what it brought. There was no need to also live through countless imagined versions of it beforehand. In the quiet of this hour, it may be worth noticing where the mind has wandered. Has it wandered into genuine preparation, clear and specific, aimed at something real? Or has it wandered into the looping repetition of imagined scenarios, borrowing tomorrow's uncertainty and asking tonight's rest to pay for it? There is no need to force this noticing into resolution. It is simply an observation, offered gently, the way an old friend might offer a thought without expecting anything from it. The future will arrive when it arrives, in whatever form it eventually takes. Tonight remains its own separate, quiet, unfinished thing. Seneca offered a particular exercise to his friend Lucilius, suggesting that when facing a feared possibility, it can help to consider it clearly and specifically, rather than allowing it to remain a vague, looming shape in the back of the mind. A vague fear, unexamined, tends to grow larger, simply through its own formlessness. A fear looked at directly, named specifically, considered honestly, often becomes more manageable than its shapeless counterpart, even when the underlying difficulty remains genuinely serious. This is not the same as dwelling. Dwelling repeats the same fear endlessly without examining it clearly. What Seneca suggested was closer to a single, honest look, asking plainly what the worst realistic outcome might actually involve. And then, having considered it honestly, allowing the mind to set the exercise down rather than returning to it obsessively throughout the night. He also observed that many of the things people fear most never actually arrive, and that a great deal of suffering is spent preparing for events that ultimately take a different shape entirely, if they occur at all. This is not a guarantee that difficulty will never come. Seneca was not a man who avoided hardship in his writing or his life. He simply believed that most imagined hardship, rehearsed again and again in the mind, added a kind of unnecessary suffering on top of whatever difficulty might eventually and actually arrive. Life would bring what it brought. There was no need to also live through countless imagined versions of it beforehand. In the quiet of this hour, it may be worth noticing where the mind has wandered. Has it wandered into genuine preparation, clear and specific, aimed at something real? Or has it wandered into the looping repetition of imagined scenarios, borrowing tomorrow's uncertainty and asking tonight's rest to pay for it? There is no need to force this noticing into resolution. It is simply an observation, offered gently, the way an old friend might offer a thought without expecting anything from it. The future will arrive when it arrives, in whatever form it eventually takes. Tonight remains its own separate, quiet, unfinished thing. Seneca offered a particular exercise to his friend Lucilius, suggesting that when facing a feared possibility, it can help to consider it clearly and specifically, rather than allowing it to remain a vague, looming shape in the back of the mind. A vague fear, unexamined, tends to grow larger simply through its own formlessness. A fear looked at directly, named specifically, considered honestly, often becomes more manageable than its shapeless counterpart, even when the underlying difficulty remains genuinely serious. This is not the same as dwelling. Dwelling repeats the same fear endlessly, without examining it clearly. What Seneca suggested was closer to a single, honest look, asking plainly what the worst realistic outcome might actually involve, and then, having considered it honestly, allowing the mind to set the exercise down, rather than returning to it obsessively throughout the night. He also observed that many of the things people fear most never actually arrive, and that a great deal of suffering is spent preparing for events that ultimately take a different shape entirely, if they occur at all. This is not a guarantee that difficulty will never come. It is simply an honest observation about the frequent gap between imagined disaster and the much narrower range of what actually tends to occur. There is a kind of quiet relief available in remembering this gap, not because it removes all uncertainty about the future, but because it offers a gentle corrective to the mind's tendency toward worst-case rehearsal, a reminder that the imagined version of tomorrow is very often more severe, more certain, and more immediate than whatever tomorrow actually turns out to bring. Seneca's letters were written to a friend facing his own uncertainties, his own fears about health, position, and the unpredictable currents of Roman political life. They were not written from a position of having eliminated fear entirely. They were written as an ongoing conversation, one friend helping another return, again and again, to a steadier way of meeting what had not yet happened. Tonight, in this same spirit, there is no need to solve every uncertain thread the mind has been holding. There is only the quiet suggestion that the future, whatever shape it eventually takes, has not yet arrived, and that this present hour remains, for now, entirely separate from whatever concerns tomorrow may eventually bring. Seneca wrote, too, about the peculiar way the mind divides its attention between the past and the future, while almost entirely neglecting the present, the only portion of time actually available to be lived. He observed that people often spend the present preparing anxiously for a future they have not yet reached, or mourning a past they can no longer change, leaving very little attention remaining for the only moment that was ever truly theirs to inhabit. This observation carries a certain gentle irony. The very thing the mind is trying to protect, a peaceful and secure life, is often sacrificed in the process of trying to protect it, traded away in exchange for endless rehearsal of futures that may never arrive in the imagined form. Seneca did not consider this trade a fair one. He believed that a life spent constantly preparing for what might happen was, in a very real sense, a life not fully lived at all, since so much of it was spent somewhere other than the present. This is worth sitting with gently, without judgment. It is not a failure to have spent time worrying about the future. It is simply the ordinary tendency of an anxious mind, doing what it has always done, trying to protect against uncertainty through anticipation. But there remains, always, the possibility of returning, if only briefly, to what is actually happening now, setting down for a moment the imagined future, and resting instead in the only time that was ever truly available to begin with. Consider a piece of unwelcome news. The news itself is simply information, a fact entering the world. What follows, the disappointment, the frustration, the anxiety, arises not from the fact alone, but from the meaning immediately assigned to it. This should not have happened. This means something is wrong with me. This will ruin everything that follows. These interpretations, arriving almost instantly and often unnoticed, shape the emotional experience far more than the original event itself. This is not to say that disappointment or grief are somehow false or unnecessary. Stoicism, when properly understood, does not ask a person to suppress their emotional responses or pretend that painful events are not painful. What it offers instead is a kind of quiet attentiveness to the layer of interpretation that sits between an event and the emotional response that follows it, a layer that often goes entirely unexamined. Consider criticism offered by another person. The words themselves are simply sounds, carrying whatever meaning the speaker intended. What determines the emotional aftermath is largely the interpretation that follows. This confirms what I always feared about myself. This person does not understand me at all. This means my work has no value. None of these interpretations are automatically true, simply because criticism has occurred. They are choices, often made so quickly and so habitually that they do not feel like choices at all. Consider delay, the postponement of something hoped for. The delay itself is simply a fact, a shifting of timing. The suffering that often accompanies it arises from interpretations layered on top. This means it will never happen. This means I have failed. This means the world is against me. Again, none of these interpretations are required by the fact of delay itself. They are habitual responses, formed over years, often without conscious examination. The Stoic invitation, then, is not to stop feeling, but to notice the space between event and interpretation, and to examine that space with a kind of gentle curiosity rather than automatic acceptance. This is not easy. Habitual interpretations often feel like simple truths rather than choices, and untangling them takes patience, practiced slowly over a long period of time, rather than achieved in a single moment of insight. There is a difference between avoiding difficult feelings and examining the judgments that shape them. Stoicism was never a philosophy of suppression. Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, and Seneca all wrote openly about grief, frustration, and hardship. What they returned to again and again was the invitation to look closely at the interpretations layered onto experience, recognizing that some of these interpretations added suffering that was not, strictly speaking, necessary. In the stillness of this hour, there is no need to examine every judgment that has shaped the day. There is simply the quiet suggestion that events and interpretations are not the same thing, that the mind is often doing more work than it needs to, adding meaning on top of meaning, until the original event becomes almost impossible to see clearly beneath the accumulated weight of everything added to it. Let this be a gentle noticing rather than an active project. Let the mind rest for now in the simple observation that not every disturbance was inevitable, and that some of it, quietly and without cruelty, might be loosened simply by seeing it more clearly. Epictetus offered a memorable phrase on this subject, observing that it is not events that disturb people, but their opinions about events. He illustrated this with a simple example, noting that death itself is not inherently terrible, since it comes to everyone equally, including those who do not fear it. What makes death feel terrible, he suggested, is the particular judgment placed upon it, a judgment that varies considerably from person to person and culture to culture, revealing that the disturbance comes from the interpretation rather than the fact itself. This example can feel stark when considered directly, and it is offered here not to minimize the weight of loss or fear, which remain real and significant, but to illustrate how thoroughly interpretation shapes even the most serious human experiences. If judgment can shape something as significant as the experience of mortality, it becomes easier to see how thoroughly it shapes smaller, everyday disturbances as well. Consider an ordinary inconvenience, a delay, a minor setback, a piece of unwelcome news. The event itself passes quickly. What often lingers is the story constructed around it, the meaning assigned, the narrative about what this inconvenience says about the day, the week, or even one's own worth. This story, once constructed, can extend the disturbance far beyond the actual duration of the original event. This is where a gentle kind of examination becomes useful, not as a demand to think positively or dismiss genuine difficulty, but as an honest inquiry into what has actually happened versus what has been added through interpretation. Sometimes this inquiry reveals that the interpretation was reasonable and proportionate. Other times, it reveals that the mind has quietly attached a much larger meaning to a much smaller event, extending suffering well beyond what the original circumstance actually required. There is no need to conduct this examination fully tonight. It is simply useful to know that it exists as a possibility, a way of gently separating fact from interpretation, whenever the mind feels weighed down by something that, on closer inspection, may be carrying more meaning than it was ever meant to hold. There is a helpful distinction here between the initial reaction to something and the story built afterward around that reaction. The initial reaction often arrives quickly, almost automatically. A flash of disappointment, frustration, or worry that passes through before conscious thought has fully engaged. This initial reaction is not what the Stoics were primarily concerned with. It is simply part of being a feeling creature, responding naturally to the world. What follows the initial reaction, however, is often where the real weight accumulates. The story built afterward, the meaning assigned, the narrative constructed about what this reaction says about the future, about one's own character, about the fairness or unfairness of the world. This second layer, built on top of the initial reaction, is where most of the Stoic attention was directed. Not because the initial reaction was considered wrong, but because the second layer was where genuine choice became available. Marcus Aurelius wrote of the mind's power to color even difficult experiences according to the meaning it chooses to assign, suggesting that a person could remove much of their disturbance simply by removing the judgment layered onto an event, leaving only the event itself, which was often far less overwhelming once separated from its accompanying interpretation. This does not happen instantly, and it does not remove the initial reaction. It simply offers, gradually, a way of preventing that initial reaction from expanding into something far larger than the original circumstance required. There is no need to apply this fully tonight. It is enough simply to know that this space exists, this gap between reaction and interpretation, and that within this gap, quietly and without force, a different response often becomes available. Among the most persistent forms of the desire for control is the wish, often unspoken, that other people behave differently than they do. This wish appears in countless forms. The wish that someone respond with more warmth. The wish that someone understand without needing to be told. The wish that someone change a long-standing pattern that causes recurring difficulty. The wish that someone simply be other than who they actually are. This wish, however natural, runs directly against one of the clearest boundaries described by Stoic philosophy. Other people's choices, judgments, and behaviors belong entirely to the category of what is not up to us. We may influence others through our own actions, our own kindness, our own clarity, but we cannot, in the end, determine what another person thinks, feels, or chooses to do. This can be a difficult recognition, particularly in close relationships, where the desire for another person's understanding or change can feel less like control and more like simple, reasonable hope. And it is not wrong to hope for these things. What creates suffering is not the hope itself, but the quiet demand layered underneath it, the belief that peace depends on the other person eventually becoming what we wish them to be. Epictetus offered a particular example of this idea, describing the discomfort that arises when we expect others to act according to our own values rather than their own. If a person values honesty deeply and expects everyone around them to share this value equally, disappointment becomes almost inevitable. Not because honesty is unimportant, but because expecting uniform behavior from other independent minds runs against the basic nature of how people actually differ from one another. This does not mean abandoning standards, or ceasing to communicate needs, or pretending that another person's behavior does not matter. It means recognizing the difference between expressing a need clearly and demanding internally that the other person must respond in a particular way in order for peace to be possible. The first is an act within your control. The second places your peace inside someone else's hands. There is a kind of relief available in this distinction, even though it can feel counterintuitive at first. Meeting others as they actually are, rather than as we wish them to be, does not mean lowering our care for them. It often allows for a clearer, more honest form of connection, one that is not constantly measuring the other person against an internal standard they were never told about and may not share. Marcus Aurelius, ruling over an empire filled with people who disappointed him in countless ways, wrote often about beginning each day by expecting difficult behavior from others, not out of cynicism, but as a form of preparation that allowed him to meet people with patience rather than surprise. This was not resignation. It was a kind of clear-eyed compassion, an acceptance that other people are shaped by their own histories, their own limitations, their own understanding, just as we are shaped by ours. In the quiet of this hour, there may be a face that comes to mind, someone whose behavior has been difficult to accept, someone whose choices have caused frustration or hurt. There is no need to resolve this fully tonight. There is only the gentle suggestion that this person, like every person, is moving through their own life according to their own understanding, and that peace does not require them to move differently in order to arrive. Letting others be themselves is not the same as ceasing to care. It is, instead, a way of caring that no longer depends on control, a way of loving that does not require the other person to become someone other than who they already are. There is a particular kind of quiet grief that comes with recognizing the limits of this influence, especially in relationships that matter deeply. It can feel at first like a kind of loss, as though accepting that another person's choices remain their own somehow diminishes the closeness of the relationship. But often the opposite proves true over time. Relationships built on the demand that another person change tend to carry a persistent undercurrent of tension. A sense that love is conditional upon eventual transformation. Relationships that release this demand, while still communicating honestly about needs and boundaries, often become steadier, less burdened by the exhausting project of trying to reshape another person into a more comfortable version of themselves. Marcus Aurelius, writing about the people in his own life, many of whom disappointed him in various ways, reflected on a particular kind of freedom that comes from accepting human imperfection as simply part of what it means to live among other people. He did not suggest lowering one's own standards or ceasing to notice when someone behaved poorly. He suggested, instead, meeting this behavior with the same steady acceptance one might offer to weather or changing seasons. Not because it did not matter, but because expecting perfect behavior from imperfect beings was never a realistic foundation for peace. This acceptance extends, too, to the recognition that other people are often working from their own private difficulties, their own histories, their own limitations, invisible to us in the moment of interaction. A sharp word may come from exhaustion rather than malice. A withdrawal may come from fear rather than indifference. This does not excuse harmful behavior, and it does not mean tolerating mistreatment indefinitely. But it does offer a slightly wider lens through which to view difficult interactions, one that does not require every disappointing behavior to be taken as a personal verdict on one's own worth. In the quiet of this hour, there is no need to resolve any particular relationship fully. There is only the gentle suggestion that peace does not require other people to finally become what we wish them to be, and that a great deal of quiet freedom becomes available the moment this particular demand, so often carried without full awareness, is allowed to soften. There is a related idea worth considering here, one Epictetus returned to often, concerning the difference between what belongs to us and what belongs to others, even within the same shared moment. In any disagreement, in any misunderstanding, there are always two sets of judgments at work, our own and the other person's. We can only ever be responsible for one of these sets. The other remains, no matter how close the relationship, no matter how well-intentioned the effort to understand, genuinely outside our authorship. This does not mean giving up on communication or connection. It means recognizing that even the best, most patient explanation cannot guarantee that another person will receive it exactly as intended, will change their mind, or will respond in the way hoped for. The offering of honest words remains within our control. What is done with those words, how they are understood, whether they lead to change, belongs to the other person entirely. This recognition can feel, at first, like a kind of loneliness, an acknowledgement that connection can never be fully guaranteed, no matter how much effort is given toward it. But there is also a quieter freedom hidden within this same recognition. Once a person stops trying to control the reception of their words, trying to control another's understanding through sheer force of explanation or repetition, a certain exhausting effort simply falls away. What remains is something more honest, an offering made clearly and then released, rather than an offering made anxiously and then defended indefinitely against every possible misunderstanding. Marcus Aurelius wrote of meeting people each day with the expectation that some would be difficult, not out of pessimism, but as a kind of readiness that allowed him to respond with patience rather than surprise. This same readiness can be gently borrowed tonight, not as a hardening against others, but as a soft acknowledgement that people, all people, remain imperfect, unpredictable, and entirely their own, no matter how much closeness or history is shared between you. The Stoics believed in living in accordance with nature, a phrase that can sound abstract until it is unpacked slowly. What they meant was not simply living close to forests and rivers, though that image is not entirely wrong either. They meant recognizing that human life exists within a much larger order, a vast unfolding of cause and circumstance that extends far beyond any single person's ability to fully perceive or control. This larger order includes the movement of seasons, the passage of generations, the rise and fall of civilizations, the quiet persistence of natural law that continues regardless of individual human wishes. Marcus Aurelius often reflected on the sheer scale of time, considering how brief a single human life appears against the backdrop of centuries, how small a single set of concerns appears against the vastness of what came before and what will continue after. This reflection was not meant to diminish the value of an individual life. Quite the opposite. By recognizing the vastness of the larger order, the Stoics believed a person could find a kind of humility that made peace more accessible. A recognition that not everything was meant to be understood, managed, or controlled by any single mind, however capable. There is something quietly restful in this idea, particularly at night, when the mind often behaves as though the entire weight of the future rests on its own vigilance. The seasons will continue whether or not you lie awake tonight. The larger order of cause and consequence will continue unfolding, shaped by countless forces entirely beyond your reach, regardless of how carefully your mind tries to anticipate every possibility. This is not fatalism in the sense of giving up on effort or care. The Stoics were not people who believed nothing mattered, because everything was predetermined. They believed instead in participating fully in life, acting with diligence and integrity, while also recognizing that the ultimate shape of events belonged to a much larger process than any individual could fully author. There is an old Stoic image, sometimes attributed to Cleanthes, describing fate as something that leads the willing and drags the unwilling. The event itself in this image remains the same regardless of one's attitude toward it. What changes is the experience of moving through it, whether with resistance, tension, and exhaustion, or with a kind of cooperative acceptance that does not require the event to be different than it already is. This image is not meant to suggest passivity. A person can still choose their actions, still work toward what they value, still care deeply about outcomes. But there remains a difference between working toward something while accepting that the ultimate result belongs to a larger unfolding, and working toward something while demanding, internally, that the larger unfolding conform entirely to personal wishes. Living in accordance with nature, then, is less about withdrawing from effort, and more about locating oneself honestly within a much larger picture. Not the center of all events, controlling every outcome through sheer will, but a participant within something vast, contributing what can genuinely be contributed, and releasing the rest to unfold according to forces that were never within any single person's hands to begin with. In this quiet hour, there is no need to resolve the full scale of this idea. It is enough simply to feel for a moment the vastness beyond the room, beyond the concerns of the day, beyond even this particular night. There is a kind of rest available in remembering how large the world actually is, and how much of it was never meant to rest on the shoulders of a single tired mind. There is a practice sometimes associated with this way of thinking, occasionally called the view from above, in which a person imagines their current circumstances from an increasing distance, first from above the room, then above the city, then higher still, until the particular worry that felt so consuming becomes one small point within an enormous unfolding landscape. This is not meant to diminish the reality of the worry. It is meant, instead, to restore a sense of proportion, reminding the mind that even significant difficulties exist within a much larger context than the narrow, immediate view often allows. Marcus Aurelius returned to this kind of perspective often, considering the vast stretches of time before his own birth, and the vast stretches that would follow after his death, populated by countless other lives, each facing their own version of uncertainty, each finding their own way through it. This was not intended to produce despair at one's own smallness. It was intended to produce a kind of quiet companionship, a recognition that the experience of facing uncertainty is not unique to any single person or moment, but shared across the entire span of human existence. There is comfort available in this shared experience, even when circumstances themselves remain difficult. Every person who has ever lain awake at night and certain about tomorrow has participated in something deeply common to human life, something that connects across centuries and cultures, regardless of the particular details of what kept them awake. Tonight's uncertainty is not separate from this long lineage. It belongs to it, one more instance, within an enormous, ongoing pattern. This recognition does not remove the specific weight of tonight's particular concern, but it may offer a slightly wider frame, one that allows the mind to hold its worry a little less tightly, knowing that it exists within something far larger than itself, something that has continued patiently across all of recorded time, and will continue long after tonight has passed into morning. There is also a quieter, more intimate version of this same idea, one that does not require imagining vast stretches of time or distant landscapes. It simply involves noticing the ordinary, unremarkable persistence of the natural world, the way trees continue their slow growth regardless of daily events, the way tides continue their steady rhythm regardless of individual concerns, the way the same moon that watches over tonight's particular worry has watched over countless other nights, countless other worries across the entire span of human history. This persistence is not indifferent in a cold or dismissive sense. It is, in its own way, deeply steadying, a reminder that the world continues its patient unfolding regardless of whether tonight's concern resolves quickly or slowly, favorably or unfavorably. There is something almost restful in this indifference, not because your concerns do not matter, but because their weight is held within something far larger and more enduring than the narrow frame of a single anxious hour. The Stoics often returned to natural imagery for exactly this reason, not as decoration, but as a genuine source of perspective. A river does not resist its own current. A season does not resist its own ending. And within this same natural order, so vast and so steady, your own particular night, however difficult, however uncertain, finds its place, held gently within something that has always continued and will continue still. This is not a call to passivity, nor an argument that individual effort does not matter within this larger order. It is simply an invitation to notice that effort and surrender were never truly opposites within Stoic thought. A person can act with full sincerity, full care, and full diligence, while also resting inside the recognition that the larger unfolding of events belongs to something considerably vaster than any single set of hands, however capable, could ever hope to fully hold. There is a particular kind of freedom that becomes available once a person separates sincere effort from attachment to results. This separation does not come easily, and it is not a single decision made once and then maintained forever. It is closer to an ongoing practice, revisited again and again, softened gradually over time, rather than achieved in a single moment of clarity. Consider the difference between two people preparing for the same task. Both work carefully. Both bring genuine effort and attention. But one person's peace depends entirely on how the task is eventually received, while the other person's peace remains rooted in the quality of their own effort, regardless of what follows. The external actions may look identical. The internal experience is entirely different. This is not a suggestion to stop caring about outcomes. Caring about outcomes is part of what gives effort its meaning. The Stoic distinction is more subtle. It asks whether a person's inner steadiness depends on securing a particular result, or whether that steadiness can remain intact even when results remain uncertain, even when they eventually disappoint. Epictetus offered an image that has remained useful across centuries. He compared life to an archer aiming at a target. The archer trains carefully, aims with precision, and releases the arrow with full attention and skill. But once the arrow leaves the bow, countless factors beyond the archer's control determine where it eventually lands. Wind, distance, the movement of the target itself. The archer's task was never to guarantee the arrow's landing. The archer's task was simply to aim and release as skillfully as possible. This image offers a kind of quiet relief. So much of the tension people carry around outcomes comes from behaving as though they were still holding the arrow long after it has already left the bow, as though continued worry could somehow still influence something that has already been set into motion. But once effort has been given, once the arrow has been released, what remains is not further control. What remains is simply the waiting, and eventually the acceptance of wherever the arrow happens to land. This is not resignation before effort. It is release after effort. The distinction matters. A person may work with full dedication, full care, full attention, and still recognize that once the work has been offered into the world will do with it what the world will do. This recognition does not diminish the value of the effort. It simply frees the person from the additional burden of trying to control something that was never within their power to control in the first place. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from continuing to grip an outcome long after any further influence has become impossible. The work has been submitted. The words have been spoken. The decision has been made. And still the mind continues turning, as though continued anxiety could somehow reach backward and adjust what has already been set into motion. Letting go of the outcome does not mean pretending the outcome does not matter. It means recognizing the natural boundary of one's own influence and allowing the mind to rest once that boundary has been reached, rather than continuing to strain against something that has already passed beyond the reach of further effort. In this quiet hour, there may be something the mind is still gripping. A conversation already finished, a decision already made, a piece of work already sent into the world. There is no need to resolve this fully tonight. There is only the gentle suggestion that the arrow, wherever it happens to land, has already left the bow, and that the archer's task for tonight is simply complete. There is a subtle but important difference between hoping for a particular outcome and requiring it in order to feel at peace. Hope can exist alongside acceptance. A person can genuinely wish for a favorable result, while also recognizing, honestly, that the result was never fully theirs to guarantee. This combination, hoping without requiring, caring without gripping, forms the quiet center of what the Stoics meant by inner freedom. This freedom is not the absence of desire. The Stoics were not advocating for indifference toward life's outcomes. They were pointing toward a particular quality of desire, one that remains engaged and sincere without becoming a demand placed upon a world that was never obligated to fulfill it. This distinction can be difficult to feel in the moment, especially when something genuinely important is at stake, when the outcome carries real weight for one's life or the lives of people cared about deeply. And yet, even in these weighty circumstances, the underlying structure remains the same. Effort belongs to you. Outcome belongs to the larger unfolding of countless factors beyond your reach. Holding both of these truths at once, without collapsing one into the other, is not a single achievement, but an ongoing practice, revisited again and again across a lifetime, softened gradually through repeated returning, rather than mastered in a single moment. There is a particular kind of relief available in simply setting down, for tonight, whatever outcome the mind has been gripping, not because the outcome does not matter, but because the gripping itself accomplishes nothing further at this hour. The effort has already been given. The words have already been spoken. The work has already been offered. What remains now is simply rest, the natural conclusion of a task already completed, whatever shape its eventual results happen to take. There is a further layer worth considering here, one concerning the way outcomes are so often used, quietly and unconsciously, as evidence about a person's own worth. A favorable result becomes proof of competence, of value, of having done something right. An unfavorable result becomes proof of the opposite, evidence of failure or inadequacy. This linking of outcome to worth is understandable, since it is a pattern reinforced by much of ordinary life, yet it places an enormous and often unfair burden on events that were never fully within a single person's control to begin with. The Stoics offered a different way of measuring worth, one located entirely within the inner territory rather than the outer one. Worth, in this framing, is measured by the sincerity of effort, the honesty of intention, and the integrity with which a person acted, regardless of how the outer world happened to respond. A person could act with full skill and full care and still meet an unfavorable outcome, not because they had failed in any meaningful sense, but because the outcome depended on countless factors beyond their authorship. This does not mean outcomes are unimportant, or that a person should stop caring about results entirely. It simply relocates the measure of worth to something more stable, something that cannot be taken away by circumstance, chance, or the decisions of others. A person can lose a desired result and still retain, fully intact, the quieter measure of having acted well. There is a kind of rest available in this relocation, particularly at night, when the mind often replays outcomes as though they were final verdicts on personal value. Tonight, whatever outcome remains uncertain or unresolved, there remains also this steadier ground beneath it, the simple, quiet fact of having tried honestly, which was, in the end, the only part of the task that ever truly belonged to you. There is a final thought worth adding here, gentle rather than instructive. This steadier ground does not need to be earned through perfect effort. Even imperfect, incomplete, or hesitant effort still belongs to this same inner territory, still counts as genuinely yours, still remains untouched by whatever outer result eventually follows. The standard was never perfection. It was only sincerity, offered as fully as circumstances allowed, and released afterward into whatever the larger world chooses to do with it. Much of what has been explored so far concerns the mind's relationship with the past and the future, the two directions in which control is most often sought and most often found lacking. The past cannot be revised. The future cannot be fully known. And yet life itself, in its actual, lived texture, occurs neither in the past nor in the future. It occurs now, in this particular breath, in this particular moment, quietly unfolding, regardless of where the mind happens to be wandering. Marcus Aurelius wrote often about the present moment, observing that a person only ever truly loses the present, since the past has already gone and the future has not yet arrived. This is a simple observation, but it carries a certain weight when considered slowly. So much anxiety is directed toward moments that do not yet exist, and so much regret is directed toward moments that no longer exist, while the only moment actually available, the present one, often passes by almost unnoticed beneath the noise of all this mental travel. This is not a suggestion to force the mind into some artificial state of presence, gripping tightly to the current moment out of a new kind of effort. That would simply become another form of control, another task added to an already tired mind. The invitation is gentler than that. It is simply a noticing, an occasional return to what is actually happening right now, without any requirement that the mind stay there permanently. Consider for a moment the actual texture of this present moment, the weight of the body settling into whatever surface it rests upon, the quiet rhythm of breath moving in and out, continuing steadily whether or not attention is placed upon it, the particular quality of darkness or dim light in the room, the distant, barely noticed sounds of the night, a settling house, a passing car, the low hum of stillness itself. None of this requires solving. None of this requires planning. It is simply present, available without effort, asking nothing of the mind except the willingness to notice it briefly before wandering elsewhere, as minds naturally do. There is a kind of rest available in this noticing, not because it fixes anything, but because it offers a brief pause from the constant reaching toward past and future that so often characterizes the mind's activity. The present moment does not need to be managed. It does not need to be controlled. It simply needs to be allowed, quietly, to be what it already is. This chapter, more than the others, asks very little. It does not build toward a conclusion. It simply rests for a while in the ordinary texture of now, the breath continuing, the body settling, the quiet room holding this particular moment, exactly as it is, without requiring anything further. Marcus Aurelius wrote that a person needs very little in order to live well, only the ability to follow the guiding voice within, present in this exact moment, without reaching backward or forward. This is perhaps the simplest and most difficult instruction found anywhere within Stoic philosophy. Not because the idea is complicated, but because the mind's habitual pull toward past and future is so persistent that returning to the present again and again requires a kind of ongoing gentleness rather than a single act of willpower. There is no failure in noticing that the mind has wandered. Wandering is simply what minds do. The practice is not to prevent wandering entirely, an impossible standard for any mind, but to notice the wandering without frustration, and to allow attention to return, softly, to the present moment whenever this noticing occurs. This return does not need to be dramatic or effortful. It can be as simple as noticing the next breath, the current weight of the body, the quiet sound of the room, before the mind, quite naturally, wanders off again. This gentle rhythm of wandering and returning is not a flaw in the process. It is the process itself. Across a single night, the mind may wander and return dozens of times, and each return, however brief, offers a small measure of rest, a small pause within the larger pattern of reaching toward past and future. There is no need to count these returns, or to judge how many times the mind has wandered. There is only the simple, repeated invitation to come back, gently, to whatever is actually present right now. The present moment does not ask to be understood. It does not ask to be analyzed or improved upon. It simply asks to be noticed, briefly, before the mind moves on, as it naturally will, to somewhere else entirely. There is something worth noticing, too, about the particular quality of the present moment at night, distinct from its quality during the busyness of daylight hours. At night, the present often arrives more quietly, less crowded by tasks and obligations, more available to simple sensation, the feeling of the sheets, the particular temperature of the room, the soft, irregular sounds that belong only to nighttime, distinct from the sounds of the day. This quiet quality makes night a particularly natural time for returning to the present, not because the practice becomes easier in any dramatic sense, but because there is simply less competing for attention. The tasks of the day have been set down, even if not finished. The obligations of tomorrow have not yet begun. What remains in this narrow window is closer to pure presence than most other hours allow. Seneca wrote of the value of unclaimed time, moments not given over to any particular task or demand, suggesting that such moments were often the most valuable a person could have, precisely because they belonged to no one and nothing except the simple fact of being alive within them. Nighttime, in its own quiet way, often provides exactly this kind of unclaimed time, an interval that asks nothing of you beyond your own presence within it. There is no requirement to fill this interval with anything, no requirement to use it productively or meaningfully, in the way daylight hours are so often expected to be used. It can simply be allowed to exist quietly as its own complete thing, asking nothing further than the willingness to notice it briefly before sleep, in its own time, arrives. Even the act of listening to these words right now, in this particular unclaimed hour, belongs to this same quiet category. It is not a task. It is not a step toward some later goal. It is simply a way of spending this present moment gently in the company of old ideas, before the mind, quite naturally, lets go of listening altogether and drifts toward whatever comes next. The night has deepened by now, and the ideas explored across these quiet hours settle, gradually, into something less like separate chapters and more like a single continuous understanding, returned to from different angles, the way moonlight might fall across a room from slightly different positions as the hours pass. The central thread running through all of it has been simple, even if it has taken many forms along the way. So much of human restlessness comes from trying to hold what cannot be held. The future, the past, the choices of others, the ultimate outcomes of our own careful efforts. None of these were ever fully within reach, however much the mind insists on reaching toward them. Stoicism does not offer a way to finally gain this control. It offers something different, and in its own quiet way, more valuable. It offers a way of understanding that peace was never meant to come from control in the first place. Peace, in this old and patient philosophy, comes from no longer struggling against the uncontrollable nature of life, from meeting uncertainty not as an enemy to be defeated, but as the basic condition within which every life, without exception, has always unfolded. This does not mean uncertainty disappears. It does not mean the future becomes any more knowable, or that other people become any more predictable, or that outcomes become any more guaranteed. What changes, slowly, gradually, is the relationship to all of this. The uncertainty remains. The struggle against it, at least for a while, in moments like this one, can soften. Epictetus spent his teaching returning to a single distinction: what is ours and what is not, until the distinction became second nature rather than an effort. Marcus Aurelius wrote privately, night after night, not because he had mastered these ideas, but because he needed to return to them again and again, the way anyone returns to something true, but difficult to hold on to for long. Seneca wrote letters to a friend, working through these same reflections slowly, across years, never arriving at some final state of completion, simply continuing the practice of returning. This is worth remembering. None of these thinkers arrived at permanent peace through some single moment of insight. They practiced repeatedly, returning to these ideas across an entire lifetime, because the mind's pull toward control does not disappear easily or permanently. It simply becomes, gradually, a little more familiar, a little less consuming, a little easier to notice and release. Tonight does not require resolution. It does not require that every idea explored across this quiet hour be fully understood or applied. It simply requires rest, the kind of rest that becomes a little more available once the mind stops straining quite so hard against the uncontrollable nature of things. The room remains quiet. The blankets hold their familiar weight. The breath continues, slow and steady, as it has all along, asking nothing of you except its own quiet continuation. Beyond the walls of this room, the larger order of life continues its vast, patient unfolding, exactly as it always has, exactly as it will continue to, regardless of whether the mind manages to release its grip tonight or simply notices gently that the grip is there. There is nothing that needs to be solved in this moment. There is only this present, ordinary quiet and the slow, natural rhythm of a life that was never meant to be fully controlled, only lived, one uncertain, unrepeatable moment at a time. If sleep has not yet arrived, there is no need to reach for it either. Sleep, like so much else explored across this quiet hour, tends to come more easily when it is not gripped tightly, when it is allowed to arrive in its own time, rather than demanded on a particular schedule. The body knows how to rest. It has done so every night of your life, without needing conscious instruction, without needing the mind's careful management. It can be trusted to do so again tonight, in its own time, in its own way. Whatever tomorrow eventually brings, it has not yet arrived. Whatever remains unresolved from today has already passed beyond the reach of further changing tonight. What remains in this exact moment is simply the quiet room, the steady breath, and the old, patient understanding that a life well lived was never a life fully controlled, but a life met again and again with a little more acceptance than resistance, a little more openness than grip. The seasons will continue turning. The larger order of things will continue unfolding. And within all of this vast, ongoing movement, there is room tonight for nothing more than rest. It may help in these final quiet minutes to return once more to the simple image that opened this reflection, the image of a mind at night trying to hold what cannot be held. That image has not disappeared. The mind may still, even now, reach toward tomorrow, toward unfinished conversations, toward outcomes still uncertain. This is not a sign that tonight's reflection has failed. It is simply what minds do, reaching again and again out of habit, out of care, out of an old and deeply human wish for certainty. What has changed, perhaps only slightly, is the way this reaching can now be met. Not with frustration at the mind for continuing to reach, but with a quiet recognition of what is actually happening, a gentle naming of the pattern, rather than a helpless surrender to it. This recognition itself is a kind of freedom, even when the reaching does not stop entirely, even when uncertainty remains fully present and unresolved. Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, and Seneca did not write from a place beyond difficulty. They wrote from within it, returning again and again to these same ideas, because the ideas were not meant to be learned once and then possessed permanently. They were meant to be returned to night after night, difficulty after difficulty, each return a little steadier than the one before, though never perfectly steady, never fully finished. This is, perhaps, the quietest and most honest thing that can be said about this entire reflection. It does not offer a final arrival at peace. It offers instead a companionship along the way, an old and patient voice reminding you gently that the reaching for control was never a personal failing, that uncertainty was never a problem to be solved, and that rest was always available, not after every difficulty had been resolved, but right here, in the middle of whatever remains unresolved tonight. There is a particular kind of dignity in this way of living, meeting each uncertain night, not with the demand that uncertainty finally end, but with the quiet willingness to rest within it anyway. This dignity does not depend on having mastered anything. It depends only on the willingness to keep returning gently to this same steady understanding night after night, for as long as it continues to be needed. If there is one thought worth carrying forward from this evening, beyond all the particular ideas explored across its chapters, it may be this: you were never meant to hold everything. No one was. The vastness of what lies beyond your control has always been vast, long before tonight, and will remain so long after. This is not a failure of your effort or your care. It is simply the shape of being alive, one small, sincere participant, within something far larger than any single mind could ever fully hold. Let this understanding settle now, without needing to be fully grasped or remembered in the morning. It is enough that it has been offered quietly into this particular night, to be carried as far as it naturally reaches, and released wherever it naturally ends. Whatever tonight has brought, whatever remains unresolved, whatever quiet worry still lingers somewhere beneath the surface of these closing words, none of it needs to be different right now, in order for rest to be possible. Rest was never conditional upon certainty finally arriving. It was always available here, in the middle of not knowing, in the middle of things still unfolding, in the middle of a life that was never meant to be fully controlled, only lived gently, one breath, 1 hour, one uncertain night at a time. Let the thinking soften, let the reaching ease, let the night hold what it has always held, quietly, patiently, without needing anything further from you at all. Rest now, quietly, within what is.